Everybody has a little collection in his mind, in his memory, of first days. Do you know what I mean by first days? Like, let's say, the first day you were in high school. Or the first day you worked at your job. Or the first day you were in the army. Or the first day that you seemed to understand more than was really good for you. And there is a point where that begins to bother you. I don't know how many people out of 1,000 are ever troubled by this problem, but I'm sure it's more than most would ever admit. You know, speaking of first days, and I suspect that these first days are the most important of days. For example, if you go to a foreign country, your first day in a foreign city is going to be the most valuable day you will spend there. And for good reason. Because you are suddenly seeing with new, fresh eyes, things which you will never notice again. And since you will never notice them again, you will never ever get to understand them. And so first days are extremely important. The first day you met someone who became a real part of your life. The first day, the really first time you knew this person, really. Those things are always floating around like a million little corks on the surface of our mind. And sometimes they're floating way back off there in shadow, in darkness, where you can't see them. I remember, speaking of first days, I suppose the most vivid first day that I have in my mind is the first day I ever worked in a steel mill. You know, again, this is a matter of perception and myth, and reality, dream, and the logique. What does a steel mill seem to you to be? If I say to you steel mill, what do you think of in your mind? How do you see it? Do you think that you've even approached it? Do you think you've even scratched the surface of a steel mill? Well, let me tell you about the first day. And remember this. I lived within 1.5 miles of most of my adolescent and childhood life. Within 1.5 miles of the greatest steel mills in America. So logically, I should know about steel mills, right? Logically, since most of the people who lived in the neighborhood worked in steel mills, the steel mill should not come as a surprise to me. Well, let me tell you about that first day. I remember this so vividly that it's as though it was some kind of a lithograph. Even better than that, a steel engraving hanging in this long corridor of my room, this room of the mind, with lights properly placed so they can be seen clearly. And I hardly ever think of it. I never look at it. It's like a picture that's in your house that you never look at. It's always there, you know? You walk in and out of the room, and there's this thing hanging. And you never look at it. And once in a while you look at it, and suddenly you say, yeah, Aristotle, contemplating a home buster. Yeah, there he is. You know? And it suddenly hits you again and again and again. And maybe one day you get so tired of this picture you throw it out. But you never can really throw it out because it's always somehow hanging in your memory. That first day. Well, let me tell you about the first day. The first day in the steel mill. I was working in what they call the mail department. Now, this is not the mail department like here at the Lieber House or at the 666 building or BBD&O or WOR. Oh, no, let me tell you that this is like being a mailman in a wild, fantastic, surrealistic city beyond all your conception. And it's a job that runs. You run constantly, and you're never in offices. You're running between great trains and screaming, howling cranes and falling pieces of metal and screaming, moving, swirling sparks constantly. And you run and run and run. And you run until you can't run anymore. And then they say, go home and come back and start running tomorrow. But I remember the first day, you see, because the steel mill is built out on the lake. You see, it's built on what they call made land. Do you know what made land is? This is land that's filled. The land moves out on a kind of slag base and foundation. This is made. It's like an animal, you see, that builds its own shell as it goes, you know? You know what I mean? That the ground that the steel mill is on is made out of the waste of the steel mill. It's perpetual motion. They just keep dumping it in the lake, and every so often they say, Charlie, we got 3 more acres now, for crying out loud, sticking out there. And they roll it down with a roller, and they build another mill on it. Eventually, I suspect the steel mill will stretch all the way to northern Canada, like a giant peninsula, all the way up the lake, and finally it'll work its way down Lake Ontario, and eventually could very well dock off the battery here, like a big snake going all the way up the St. Lawrence. I'm not kidding you. That's the way it is. And eventually it's going to be one big mill. And you get that feeling, you know, when you're working in it, like you're working in a cancer. You just don't know which. It's going bigger and bigger, and it's always being built, never being torn down, being built. Well, I'm a kid, remember. And I'm 16. I go down and I get my working permit. And this is a very exciting moment, you see. And I'm going to work, and school has just gotten out. And I have, like they say out in the steel mill, you got to have a drag. Well, everybody had to have a drag. And by the way, is there anybody out there who does honestly have a drag? You know, I say, you know, is anybody out there who's really got a drag? Or is that a Midwestern expression again? You never heard the expression? Huh? Pull. No. Pull has to do with City Hall. No, seriously. That's a very different thing. We used to use that expression, oh, he's got pulled down City Hall. No, we said, oh, boy, that guy's got a drag somewhere. That really means that, you know, you really got something going in the mill, you know, that there's an important guy, you know. Well, it's a funny thing. Being an amateur radio operator, it was funny. I was on the air. I'm this little feckless youth, and I'm on 160 meters, and so I find one night that I'm sitting there talking to the superintendent of the rolling mill. Actually, it was the superintendent of the roll shop. I mean, this is like talking to God out there. No, you have no idea how important this is. And I suddenly began to sweat. Because, really, it's like a little actor somewhere finds himself on the telephone with Daryl Zanuck. Oh, you know, you just don't expect to do this. And I'm sitting there, I'm talking, hi, Gil, how are you, boy? You're coming in here, so-and-so, blah, 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 a pair of 2A5s in the final here, Class B modulation. Yeah, I'm using a double extended ZEP with 600 ohm feed. Yeah, blah, blah. What do you do, Gil? I'm going to Ham and High. I'd like to know what you do over there. So, okay, Gil, come on in. Gil comes back and he says, I'm the foreman of the rolling mill in Inland Steel. I'm out in a sweat like that. Well, I don't know how to get around to it, you know. So I say, yeah, well, that's a very interesting job you must have there, Mr. Gil. That's a very interesting job you got there. Steel mill, huh? Well, by George, you know, it's a coincidence, Gil. There's nothing I wanted to work in more than the steel mill. Strangely enough, you know, and I've always been interested in rolls. And, oddly enough, I'm getting out of school next week. And say, Gil, I wonder if, I don't want to put you in any trouble, but, anyway, to make a long story short, this poor, friendly, kindly man called me, and I went down to his home. He called, he said, come on over some night, and he lived about 3 miles away, and gee, I was in the superintendent's home. And here was this feckless youth. And he said, look, son, he said, and by the way, this was when jobs were not easy to get, and he says, look, son, you take this tomorrow morning. Take this to the clock house, the number 1 clock house. Well, of course, this was a name that was so familiar to me. You know, it's like, say, take it to the MGM main gate. Say this to a bid actor in Hollywood. He knows about this. It's a famous thing. He says, take this to the number 1 clock house, and you show this to the man who's inside the little office just as you get in, and he will send you down to the place where you'll be talked to. And he said, I'll call him, and it'll be all set. Well, I'll tell you, that night I couldn't sleep. Oh, boy. I mean, I was sweating. I told my mom, I says, I got a job in the mill. She says, you're going to work in the mill? Of course, immediately, mothers, The mill is this monster over here, and once in a while you hear this big booming sound and sirens going and ambulances and all, the whole bit. Immediately mothers suspect that the ocean is going to swallow you up, and that's it, and spit you out, nothing but core and seeds and stuff. Well, anyway, oh no, don't worry about me, Ma. So that morning, and I forgot to mention that he told me that I should get to the clock house about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. Oh, well, that's the mill. It's like the sea. I mean, the mill is like the sea and like the Great Plains. You don't sleep, the crops are taken in early. So I go down there and I got this paper, and boy, I'll tell you, I'll never forget it. I drive this little car I had this little V8. I park it in the great big parking lot. Millions of cars where the mill was, and the sun was just coming up. It was just getting bright, just getting light, and there's a strange chill around the steel mill. I cannot explain this. Do you know the chill that exists around totally inhuman things like crypts? Have you ever been inside of a pyramid? You haven't. Have you ever been inside of a great temple of some kind made of stone? Well, there is a chill, a strange, unearthly, inhuman chill. Well, I parked my car and I'm wearing this T-shirt because back home it was warm, It's summertime, it's June. And I get out of the car and I walk through the parking lot, and this chill is beginning to reach out and get me. It's funny, I'm cold. The first time, cold, and it's not cold like that there. And it's beginning to get chilly. Well, I get on the main pathway, which is a big concrete areaway that leads to the number 1 clock house. And there are thousands of men walking towards me and walking with me. And this was the first peculiar, strange premonition, intimation I had that life isn't exactly the way it seems to be. Not exactly. Now, I do not know what it is. I've spent my life since trying to figure out just what it is. But it isn't what it seems to be. Because here were all these men. They were all walking. And they were walking fast, going towards the mill. And there were great crowds of them coming back. And they had a kind of dead look on their faces, which I cannot describe except to say that it was the kind of deadness that is, well, it's deadness that is alive. A dead quality of a kind of, how can I say it except to say that it's like an automobile or a machine that looks like it's moving fast, but it's got a burnt-out clutch. And it stands in the garage, beautifully streamlined and leaning forward. But it's not going to go. And there is a quality of deadness about a car in a garage. And yet, it looks alive. Does this mean anything? And these men were all walking, and they were all wearing lumberjacks, and they had hats on with buttons and stuff. And there I am jostling there with my cotton T-shirt on, and I'm getting cold. Now, I don't know whether I was getting cold because of the mill or because of this aura that is emanated from this strange place. Well, I finally got into the clock house, and thousands of guys are going through. The clock house is just that. It's the place where you punch in. And remember, this steel mill employed something like 41,000 men. Divide it by 3, and that's the number of men that went through that clock house 3 times a day. You see, there were 3 shifts. And so this enormous push is going through, and I walk up to the man who was in the little desk there, and somehow my idea of work and working in the mill was completely different from this. I gave him my sheet of paper, which Mr. whatever his name was had written down something. Call so-and-so, call number so-and-so, check on this kid, or whatever it was he wrote. And the guy didn't say a word to me. He just looked down, okay. Picked up the phone, he dialed something. He says, Mr. So-and-so, blah, blah, yeah. Okay. He hangs up. He says, all right, kid, get on the bus. And he says, go down to, tell him you want to get off at the number 1 stores. One of the guys will tell you where the number 1 stores is. I said, number 1 stores, and suddenly it was becoming very real. And up to this point, working in the steel mill had been an idea. Now, you see what I mean about the myth and the reality? It had been an idea. Suddenly he says, get off at number 1 stores. Well, I had an idea. Stores. What is the stores? Stores. I could see places where guys bought chewing tobacco, this kind of thing, and ice cream cones and stuff. Well, I get into this bus, and there was the bus, and it was a long, flat, strange conveyance where men sat all hock to hock. It was a bus that looked like it was 200 feet long, and it was made out of a black, strange, rough, welded sheet metal. And the windows were wide open. There were no windows at all, just big squares cut out of the sheet metal. And suddenly, again, I was faced with the reality of everything is there's no nicety. You know what I mean? And we're sitting on this long metal seat. And on the other side are these guys all sitting in long metal things, and everyone is just sort of just looking ahead, carrying lunch buckets, and the sun is coming up over the lake. And remember, it's June. I have just gotten out of school. Do you know what spring vacation, summer vacation is? It was no time now. There was absolutely no season. It was nothing. I was in a foreign country, not only a foreign country, a foreign world. And I'm sitting, and we go, the bus, you can't hear anything. It's made of sheet metal. Have you ever ridden in a sheet metal bus with big, flat, solid rubber tires, no air in them, just and riding over what they call a slag road? A slag road is a road that's made out of big chunks of iron slag packed down deep. And I'm aware around me, as I look out through this window, no longer is the steel mill a thing that you see on the horizon. It's no longer even a thing that can be recognized, you see, because you can recognize things on the horizon. You can recognize the moon from here. On the surface of the moon, you won't be able to. You can recognize problems in Katanga from here. But in Katanga, you can't. I can assure you of that. You can recognize what should be done by the administration here. But when you're sitting at a big oak table with the foreign ministers from Nairobi, you can't. And so I'm sitting in this bus, and it's going, and I see outside of these windows. I don't want to look eager, you know. That's the worst thing when you get into a terrible foreign country or a strange world, is to let everyone know that you're not a native. And so I'm sitting, but I'm looking out casually, you know, and I see these great buildings on either side, so close that you could reach out and brush them with your hands. Big square cutouts in the buildings, and I could see enormous ingots, boom, boom, back and forth, sparks, and it sounded like, to the ear which was not trained, it sounded like there was nothing but a continual scream cutting the air. A great, great scream of all the machinery, everything all together. And I'm sitting. And I said to the guy next to me, say, you know where number one stores is? Number one stores? You want that, kid? I said, number one stores. I want to get. I don't know where they are. And he turns. And somebody sitting across from me says, number one store, to tell. Hey, Jerry, number one store, isn't that down there by the number 3? Down by the number 3 AC down there. Kid, get off by number 3 AC. You're closer there. Well, I didn't know whether to, say, well, I don't know where number 3 AC is. So I sat for a couple of minutes, and I just sat. And finally we got to a place where a lot of men got off. And I looked out. I thought I'd see something that says number 3 AC. Nothing. Just great black buildings, smoke and steam. And right next to me, right out, you could reach out. Have you ever been 3 inches from the side of a steam engine? Steam came into the bus. Oh, I'm sitting, I'm really worried now. I don't know what I'm getting into. And finally, I thought, well, I'll have to get off. So I got off with all these men, and the bus continued to go with half of the men off into the distance, and there I am. Well, there was an office into which maybe 25 guys went. And so I get in, I walk in the office, and there's a man with a guard's uniform, and I said, I'm looking for the number one stores. Number one stores, kid, that's another 1.5 miles down there. He says, it's past the 14-inch mill. What are you doing here? I says, well, how do you get there? Well, the bus is gone, kid. Just go on, walk down there past the 14-inch mill. You'll see, it's just right past the 14-inch mill. Ask for Hennessy. Past the 14-inch mill, ask for Hennessy. Well, I went walking down this road, and this road was not a road like you think of roads for cars. It was a road for what they call hot metal cars. Great zeppelins filled with molten steel came moving down, and I could feel the heat from perhaps 200 or 300 yards away, and I'm hiding, cowering next to this building. And I kept walking and walking and walking, and sure enough, believe it or not, there was a sign that said 14-inch merchant mill. 14-inch merchant mill shipping dock. I'm getting there. So I walk up to the dock there where these guys are all sitting there. A couple of them have got big air hammers strung over their back, and I says, any of you men know where Hennessy is? Hennessy? Who? Hennessy? Bob Hennessy and the coal strip? I said, no, Hennessy in the stores. Hennessy. Hey, Chuck, do you know Hennessy in the stores? Never heard of him, kid. Well, where are the stores? Oh, they're down just around the next corner. You go right past the AC shop. You'll see the AC shop, and there's the stores there. Well, I made the turn, and there's the AC shop, and finally there was a little sign over the doorway. It says, do not enter stores unless you have a pass from your foreman. I had no pass. So I go up to the door. I figure they're going to let me in. I said to the fellow, I have to see Mr. Hennessy in the stores. Where's your pass, kid? Well, to finally get it down to the basic point, I finally arrived in the stores. And I'm sitting there, and here's a man comes out. He said, I'm going to fit you with safety shoes, kid. I see you got a note from Columbus. You got to get to work. The stores where they give you safety shoes and goggles. I said, well, what am I going to do? I don't know. That's none of my business, kid, huh? You're working for Columbus over there. You're working for Columbus over in stationary shipping. I have no... What the note says, don't come and ask me about that. That's not my problem, kid. You get safety shoes and goggles. And I walked out of the stores with a big pair of safety shoes that weighed 40 pounds each and a pair of goggles. And the sound rose and rose and rose and rose. It was screaming and hollering around me. I had nowhere to go, no place to go. I had no point of reference. And I went into a doorway where there was a telephone. I picked up the telephone, and I instinctively dialed 0. And I got this voice on the phone. It was the operator, the plant operator. I said, I want to talk to Mr. Columbus, please. Mr. Columbus. I says, yes, Mr. Columbus, who is the superintendent of the rolling shop. Oh, yes, Mr. Columbus, of course, sir. She thought I was a big man. I get Mr. Columbus and say, hi, Gil. Hey, Gil, this is W9QWN. I'm over here in the 2AC, Gil. Will you please come and get me? Well, 20 minutes later, I'm in the stationary shipping department, and that was only the beginning. That day, I learned something very important. I haven't discovered yet what it is.